Wednesday, on the anniversary of the March on Washington, President Obama stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. On this engraving that marks the very same spot where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood 50 years ago. The president's view this week was very much the same as the one that unfolded before Dr. King in 1963. A crowd of people gathered around the reflecting pool, listening to the words that resounded across the National Mall and throughout history. I have a dream. When President Obama took King's place this week, he paid homage not only to King's dream, but to the tireless efforts that brought this dream to fruition in the form of landmark civil rights policy.
Because they kept marching, America changed. Because they marched, the civil rights law was passed. Because they marched, a voting rights law was signed. Because they marched, doors of opportunity and education swung open so their daughters and sons could finally imagine a life for themselves beyond washing somebody else's laundry or shining somebody else's shoes.
And yet, in a moment of Sankofa, even as the president looked back at the successes of the civil rights movement, he also recognized the work that today still remains unfinished.
To secure the gains this country has made requires constant vigilance, not complacency. Whether by challenging those who erect new barriers to the vote, or ensuring that the scales of justice work equally for all and the criminal justice system is not simply a pipeline from underfunded schools to overcrowded jails, it requires vigilance.
The president linked that impending future with that historic past and positioned himself right in the middle as the living embodiment of what can be accomplished through the struggle for equality.
Because they marched, city councils changed, and state legislatures changed, and Congress changed, and yes, eventually the White House changed.
So here's the trick. Listening to President Obama's words, accompanied by that visual image of him standing literally in Dr. King's place, it's easy to see the president as the inheritor of King's legacy. But pause. Take a look at this photo. This was taken on March 18, 1966, when Dr. King met with President Lyndon B. Johnson in the White House. By this point, Dr. King was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference chairman, and they had turned their attentions toward a fair housing campaign in Chicago. And President Johnson is trying unsuccessfully to push Congress to pass legislation banning discrimination in housing. Now, when you think about President Obama as the successor to one of the men in this picture, where would you seat him at this table? Careful. With the image of the president standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial still fresh in your mind, you might be tempted to put him in King's position. But you'd be wrong, or at least only partly right. Because if you look only at the optics, you're missing the picture. In the photo, one man is the visitor. Another man is at home. One of these men is pushing for housing reform from outside the White House walls. The other is vested in the power of the state to implement those reforms into law. President Obama is not Dr. King. He's President Johnson. President Obama, like LBJ, is the inheritor of the executive office that only 44 Americans have ever occupied. And yet, even as you draw a direct line linking Presidents Obama and Johnson in the presidential lineage, it's hard to imagine the existence of a President Obama without the life and work of a Martin Luther King. Which leaves us with a complicated question in this historical moment. What is our expectation of the American presidency when the person who occupies the White House is black? Joining me now, Joy Reid, managing editor of thegrio.com, and MSNBC contributor Raul Reyes, contributor for NBC Latino, and a columnist for USA Today. Michael Skolnik, editor-in-chief of globalgrind.com. He's the white guy at the table. He is also political director of for Russell Simmons, and Adam Serwer, who's a reporter for MSNBC.com. He is a black guy at the table. Play this game with us, folks, right? Okay, so we're getting, I'm teasing there, but I'm teasing there in part because my whole goal here is to complicate race and politics a little bit. I think there can be a push from the supporters of the president to see every piece of opposition to him as naked racism, and for supporters of the president to see everything he does as necessarily in the civil rights tradition. How do we navigate the complicated nature of race in this space?
No, I mean, it's amazing because King never sought elected office, clearly. I mean, in 1964, a year after this march, which we have to remember, it was a commentary to Congress. Every single member of Congress was invited in 63, as they were this year. We should remember mind, and they were invited there to spectate, not to speak. And they were invited there because there was a bill that President Kennedy had introduced in Congress, a civil rights bill that took a year to pass because it was going nowhere. You had 75 members of the House and Senate show up at the march in '63, and they politely listened, and then nothing happened. And that was that march was a commentary on power. President Kennedy was not invited to speak. They met with him after. They all went into his office after. He commended them on their speeches, but they were there to support legislation and to get these 10 demands through Congress. This year, what you had were 3 presidents, the daughters of 2 presidents, including Johnson and Kennedy, on stage talking to the audience and saying to them essentially that you have to go out and then re-agitate again the same Congress of the United States.
Yeah, and in fact, let's listen to the president say exactly that, and then, Adam, I want you to respond to this.
Everyone who realizes what those glorious patriots knew on that day, that change does not come from Washington, but to Washington. The change has always been built on our willingness, we, the people, to take on the mantle of citizenship. You are marching.
So, but the complicated thing is when he says it's not from Washington, he's Washington in that moment in a way that has never happened before.
Well, right. And I think what he's saying is that Obama is saying to us that he cannot actually play the King role and the Johnson role at the same time. He can actually only play the Johnson role. And I think what's happened is that, to a certain extent, the entire speech is Obama telling everybody not to see his presidency as a mark of racial progress that we actually have overcome. In fact, almost the entire speech is him saying we haven't overcome. We've come a long way, but we haven't overcome, and we can't forget that. And it's your job to pressure not just Congress, but also me to do what needs to be done.
Right. I think one other thing that's very telling in this speech is when we listen to his words, when he's talking about the speech, he is drawing a distinction in the sense that, as you mentioned, that Martin Luther King, he was an activist, he was not a politician, and in the role that President Obama is now, he is constrained by the office, so he cannot be the one leading the call to action. He can help push the legislation along, but that is not his role. So I think he's, in a sense, just because of what he embodies, he's walking an impossible line, especially when we look at where our country is now. If you want to look at the progress we have made in equality and civil rights, factor out his presidency, many of our public policies that have helped fight racism, such as affirmative action, the Voting Rights Act, school desegregation policies, those we are going backwards in that area. So, I mean, he is in a very precarious position here.
Yeah, I think that he, in his speech, still feels like an outsider in Washington. I think he's treated like an outsider in Washington. I think he's still fighting the fight that he never thought he had to fight once he got into the White House. And I think that's what complicates things. I look at him as the coach of the team, and the owner is still white, right? So although we have a black coach, we still have an owner of this nation that is still white. And so he is still fighting those powers of white establishment that is controlling things like Voting Rights Acts, that is controlling things like affirmative action, that is controlling things like women's rights, that he's still fighting those fights. So he gets on that stage in front of the world as supposed to be the embodiment of Dr. King, but he doesn't feel, either or.
So here's a challenge I face then. I'm generally a supporter of the president. I have my critiques of him. I hate the higher education thing recently. But there's a part of me that wants to say, yeah, but dude, really, this is what we got the vote. We went out, we did it, we voted, we've elected you. Are you saying then that it means, and not just him, but for all of us, that it therefore means nothing? And in fact, not only that it means nothing, but that maybe we'd be better off electing only white representatives, because then they wouldn't provoke the kind of racial anxiety that President Obama seems to evoke from the right. So in fact, we should never really run these candidates of color anymore, because it doesn't make any difference if a candidate of color wins, and in fact, it'll cause all of this negative backlash. Is that the story we end up telling? I mean, go ahead.
Well, I think when he quoted Dr. King in his speech, he said exactly what the situation is. He said, Dr. King said, what's the point of an integrated table where you can't afford the meal? And where we are is we have the integrated table. We don't have the second part of that. And I think that's exactly what the message that the president was trying to say.
I'm not even sure the table's integrated. I think the rule is you could come to the table, right? There's no law against you coming, but it's not clear to me that the table
can't necessarily get there.
And I mean, the limitations, imagine for a moment, if Dr. King had become president of the United States, what if he'd run against Goldwater, or he'd run in '68? The exact same thing would have happened. It would have provoked this tremendous, horrifying sort of backlash. And then the idea would be, how would the country work through that? The thing that's symmetrical between King and Obama is that you have this African American who becomes president, and it provokes this real backlash, some of which is racial, some of which is about a bigger sort of demographic anxiety that has something to do with race, but has also to do with the changing economy and people's anxiety within it. And so I think what he's saying is, he was up there with Oprah too.
Yeah.
And he was saying the success of a few of us does not mean that we've overcome, but he keeps provoking you to fight the battle.
And we should probably not forget, as you pointed out, that here was this March for Policy. The Congress does not act, but what does happen just weeks after the march, 4 little girls are killed by white supremacists in the basement of their church during Sunday. So there was a response.
Exactly.
But it was on a different. I will say we're going to stay on this topic when we come back. But just as we go out, I want you to see an image. And we're talking about the complications of the president being African American. There's this image from this week at the March on Washington. President Obama's face on the American flag in the place where for me, this image was such a strikingly complicated one. What would it mean to have simultaneous racial pride and American patriotism? We've had a lot of anxiety about the flag in our past. So anyway, stay right there. More on this when we come back.